Please.
For just a moment. Okay, now we're live. Thank you.
Don, please proceed.
Good morning, members of the committee. I'm joined today by the co-chairman of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, State Budget Director Kevin Hibbard. For the newer members, we appear before you for the next 30 minutes or so in a slightly different capacity with a different hat on, as co-chairman of CREG, not as the LSO Budget Fiscal Administrator and the State Budget Director. The views of CREG are truly that of a consensus group. Next, while I present publicly the views of CREG regularly, I wish to acknowledge that the CREG members and the contributors, in this case, Dr. Winlin Liu, for authoring the first draft of the January report, Caleb Simpson in the State Treasurer's Office for contributing investment acumen, and Matt Wilmarth, who took an increased role in the publication of this LSO fiscal profile. Both documents that we are here to present to you today are posted publicly on the website, available in hard copy at the LSO main office. The January CREG is intended to be a revision, not a rewrite of the October report. There are 4 changes. 1, we modified natural gas prices. We increased the price for calendar year 2022 by 40 cents per MCF to $7.40. We decreased the natural gas price in calendar year 2023 by 15 cents to $5.75. Let's visit about this just briefly, and then I'll go into more detail. We did this increase on calendar year 2022 prices based upon 8 months of known producer tax receipts and 2 months of forecast prices or actual spot prices. Then we looked at the outward market in 2023 and modified downward, and I'll get into more details as to why later in my presentation. The second change to this report is a significant decrease in investment income from the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund in the amount of $99.9 million. However, this has no impact on the budget reserve account or the general fund. The impact of that decline, because of the guarantees and the mechanisms under the spending policy, is borne by the LSRA and the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund reserve account. The LSRA loses $44.9 million in forecast revenue because it is not guaranteed under the spending policy. And the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund reserve account loses $56.2 million. Don't worry about these numbers. I will show you where they're all printed on one page at the very end as well. And if you do want to follow along immediately, you can see the changes by fund on the last page of the LSO fiscal profile. So just very briefly on line 32 of page 7 of the LSO fiscal profile, you will see a decline in investment income distributions to the Legislative Stabilization Reserve account in the amount of $44.9 million. So that's all summarized there on the last page as to the impacts by fund. Next, the third change in the January CREG is a decrease in investment income to the Common School Permanent Land Fund in the amount of $67.8 million. Again, the only account that is impacted is the Common School Permanent Land Fund reserve account. The school foundation program is unaffected because it has a 5% spending policy, which is guaranteed. So no impact to the operating accounts, but the reserve accounts will have a lower forecast balance. Finally, the fourth change in the January CREG is to state royalties, and we increased those by $15 million based upon known receipts to date. We have half of the year done, and we were about 70% or so of the revenue for the full year. An increase to state royalties impacts 2 accounts. First of all, it increases the permanent fund, the corpus of the Common School Permanent Land Fund, by 2/3 of the amount, in this case, $10 million of the 15, and $5 million increase to the school capital construction account. If you wanted to see that again, and you're following along on page 7, that appears on line 60 and 62 of the impact by fund. So those are the four changes: natural gas prices, investment income in two places, to the permanent fund and to the common school fund, and state royalties. Fairly modest changes to the operating accounts, more impactful changes when it comes to the reserve accounts. I'll go into each of those in a little bit more detail. With respect to natural gas, in the last 6 to 8 weeks of calendar year 2022, we really saw extraordinary events on the West Coast. They also had not prepared, in the opinion of Craig, for the winter weather by building their storage reserves of natural gas. When the winter weather hit in October, and Northern California in particular, prices increased quite dramatically. For example, the Opal average price in October was $5.28. The subsequent month in December, the average price was $28.18, over a 5-time increase in that month, indicating the colder weather and the lack of storage for heating purposes. Nonetheless, on January 6th, Reuters news article, I think that's a fairly widely read news outlet, had the following to say regarding future natural gas prices. Energy futures for crude oil, refined products, and natural gas have plummeted in the new year, that's 2023, as traders reconsider the near-term worries over cold weather and fears of supply storages and dumped contracts. Let me continue to read 2 more sentences here. U.S. natural gas prices tumbled 18% in the first week of January, the biggest slide on record to start a year. The 12% drop in distillate futures was the biggest dive to start a year since 1991. Distillate consumption typically rises in the winter season. U.S. West Texas Intermediate, Brent, and U.S. gasoline futures all had their biggest weekly decline to start a new year since 2016. WTI down 7%, Brent down 7.3%, U.S. gasoline down 7.3%. Gives you a indication of the future. Craig took that into account and did modestly lower our forecast for calendar year 2023 natural gas prices, 15 cents. So a rather modest decline from $5.90 to $5.75. Let me explain why. And if you're listening and maybe you're a producer and you're looking at today's market prices, Henry Hub is trading at $3.89 this morning. Cheyenne Hub, just south of here, about 6 miles, is trading at $3.06. And yet Craig is at $5.75, over $2.50 higher. Why is that? Well, again, our friends on the western side of the state selling at Opal this morning are selling at $15.39. So we're averaging all of those hubs out, as well as taking into account the futures, and ended up with that $5.75 average price.
As you consider that, which direction do we have the most volume going? So Opal's going west, Cheyenne's headed east. In the majority, the largest volume now is going west. Is that accurate or not? Which would impact that determination?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I think Craig or excuse me, Kevin or Matt might correct me, but I believe this was discussed in Craig with more knowledgeable people on the markets than myself. And I believe the rule of thumb distribution in the past year has been 50% sales out of the Cheyenne Hub, or on the eastern side of the state, 10% out of the Northwest Pool, and 40% out of Opal. So it is slightly less out of Opal than the Cheyenne Hub. I did want to just the pricing in the state of Wyoming.
Is Northwest Hub the same as the Henry Hub?
No, Mr. Chairman, it is a Wyoming hub.
Okay.
This current pricing environment of natural gas is really extraordinary when it comes to the state of Wyoming. And let me give you another example. The average spot price sales at Opal over the calendar year. So not just a day, but over the whole calendar year 2022 was $10.71 at Opal, and at the Cheyenne hub south of town here was $6.58, a $4.13 differential. And there may be producers here who have a more history than I do, but I've looked back 20, 30 years and could not find anything near that history. It used to be flipped, in fact, where the Cheyenne hub enjoyed higher prices than the Opal pub. To have that $4 over a calendar year average is really extraordinary. Mr. Chairman, if there are no questions on natural gas, I'll move to our
causal link. Do we know, it's not up to the California state government to order the storage to be kept in anticipation of winter. It's their utility. Is there something in the regulatory scheme there that the utility did not routinely store up natural gas in anticipation of the winter? Because whatever they're doing, we want to make sure they keep doing that.
Mr. Chairman, I think a variety of factors contributed to this. First of all, as the news accounts this morning indicate, they are experiencing a very high participation event and have been for several weeks, and it is colder than normal. The demand is higher. With respect to storage, those are independent decisions. However, if you look back in June and July, natural gas prices were extraordinarily high, uncharacteristically high for the summer events. Typically, they're higher in winter, lower in summer and the shoulder seasons. And it has an opportunity for utilities to build their storage when prices are low. And so those independent decisions I won't comment on, but the prices were high when they normally would fill their storage.
So not likely to be repeated soon. That's web of circumstances.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's true. We've seen one other case of this, and it was approximately 2 years ago, perhaps 3 years, where the secondary source of natural gas for the northern west coast is a pipeline, or actually a set of two pipelines that comes out of northern or southern Canada. And one of those went offline due to a breach, an explosion. And that also was beneficial to Wyoming natural gas prices as the supplier.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if there are no further questions on natural gas, I'll move to investment income. Two things happened here in the past 3 or 4 months. First of all, the external investment managers who are investing Wyoming assets in equities and MLPs, that's master limited partnerships, think pipeline companies, for example. Those external managers managing Wyoming's assets have transitioned to safer securities in this financial climate. And in doing so, those safer securities are yielding lower dividends than expected. Secondly, in terms of the fixed income portion of the state's portfolio, both our internal and our external investment managers are not selling legacy low coupon bonds due to the performance in the total return portfolio. In short, what that means is it's taking longer to achieve, meaning we have billions of dollars of low interest bonds. They're not selling those, they're holding those until, at least in some cases, until maturity, not necessarily all cases, but in some cases till maturity. As a result, it's going to take longer to achieve these higher interest rates on bonds. Craig, and to our defense, perhaps should have known, first of all, we use the yield curve in making our October forecast. And secondly, we surveyed all of the external managers who are managing Wyoming's assets to arrive at our estimates in October. Nevertheless, over the first 5 months of actual returns, we can observe that the interest being generated and the dividends being generated and deposited are significantly lower than anticipated. So we have reduced the PMTF estimated yield, and yield is comprised of only interest and dividends. This has nothing to do with capital gains and losses. Reduce the yield on the PMTF from 3.34% to 2.26%. We made this adjustment only for 1 year.
3.34 to what?
2.26. And this also appears in the first row on table 3 in the report. We do anticipate that eventually the external managers will roll over their investments and benefit from a higher interest rate environment. But perhaps, well, we were too aggressive in terms of the timing for that. The second component of that investment in income modification is on the Common School Permanent Land Fund. And this is the first row of table 4. And this is a decrease of 4.59% to 3.20%. So again, a reduction of approximately 1.2% from lower forecast interest and dividends. As a comment on this, you can see the impact of just over $100 million to the 2 primary reserve accounts, the Common School Permanent Land Fund Reserve Account and the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund Reserve Account. That has no impact again on any of the bills before you, capital construction, the state budget, local governments. However, for the members of the Select Committee on Capital Financing and Investments, your transition to oftentimes referred to as 5X or 5 times the reserve account balances for purposes of total return, you used the actual June 30th, 2022 balance, not the forecast 2023 balance. So that actual balance has not changed. But if there are members who wish to change to the forecast balance and away from the actual balance, there is a sizable increase in the necessary appropriations for that bill. It works out to be about $175 million increase to those total appropriations if you want to move from the actual balances to the forecast balance.
So the 175 million, how do you break that down between the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund and the Common School Reserve accounts?
Yes, $108.9 million for the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund and $67 million for the Common School. And I believe those add up to 175.9.
And then Don, explain using actuals versus forecast.
Mr. Chairman, that is certainly a policy choice. Whether or not you wanted to, the 5X was a policy choice in itself, and it's a point in time. At what point is it going to be 5 times the spend? And the committee during this interim work selected a known value as of June 30th, 2022. We knew that balance might rise or it might fall. As of the October grade, it was actually projected on the PMTF side, I believe, to rise a bit, and it would projected to fall a bit on the Common School side. So it's going to change. This is a fairly significant change. You can see almost $175 million and certainly a sizable amount of reduced forecast revenue. Now, I would caution, we do not forecast capital gains. We do not forecast capital losses. It is possible that the State Treasurer's Office harvests those losses and further reduces the balance in those reserve accounts, or alternatively, harvests gains and increases those reserve account balances. Just for your,
before you move on, I want to make sure that my notes are accurate. I heard you say cumulatively between the Common School Public Land Fund and the PMTF, these investment income hits were $100 million to the 2 reserve accounts. Was it 100 million hit that you said to the 2 reserves? But then to top off the reserve accounts in the the goal for the 5X bill is 175. Where's the extra 75 million come from if the hit is 100 million?
Mr. Chairman, I had the same problem, honestly. And what's that disconnect? And the disconnect is even with October, Craig, you weren't using the forecast. You were using the actual.
Oh, okay.
And so I had the same.
That's the delta.
That's the delta. Yes, sir.
Okay.
At the bottom of page 3 on the report, we do, for transparency purposes, report what the capital gains and losses to date have been, although they are not included. So for that purposes of transparency, we have net capital gains in the PMTF of $8.8 million to date. And
Wait.
bottom of page 3 of the green Craig report.
Oh, green.
So net capital gains to date on the PMTF of 8.8 million
That's for January or for
through 5 months.
5 months?
And net capital losses to the Common School Permanent Land Fund of $11 million. So in the grand scheme of things, that is
Yeah, peanuts.
a fairly modest amount compared to historical averages or that sort of thing. So there haven't been sizable losses or sizable gains realized by the state treasurer's office in the first 5 months. Now, I include this caveat regularly. The first 5 months, these are not linear relationships. The next month could have quadruple that amount from one account.
My portfolio is nonlinear as well. That's the polite term.
Mr. Chairman, if there aren't any questions on investments, I'll proceed to state royalties. And once again, we are well ahead of pace on our actual receipts of state royalties. This is largely due to robust oil and natural gas royalties and production. But unlike our statewide forecasts, which are candidly much closer, why are we off on state royalties? Well, because not only do we have to take into account production and price, we have to take into account location, right? On what parcels is this production occurring? And sure enough, state lands are benefiting from these higher prices to a large degree. We have increased that amount by $15 million, of which $5 million goes to the SCCA for available for immediate expenditure for school facility purposes, and $10 million will be deposited into the corpus of the Common School Permanent Land Fund and is inviolate to future legislatures and yourselves. Those are the only 4 changes to our forecast. Rather than walk through the entirety of the goldenrod, I really do want to draw your attention to page 7 because it breaks out each individual change and how it impacts the accounts. On the general fund, starting on row 4, you had no changes to sales and use tax, very modest change to severance taxes deposited over the biennium to the general fund. Investment income, you'll see a large decline of $89.7 million. However, that is made up for in line 16, which is a revised expenditure appropriation or transfer. That's the spending policy. So anything that is lost in the general fund is made up for under the spending policy guarantee by line 64 through 70. On the budget reserve account, it does benefit from severance taxes, FMRs, and state agencies over the past quarter have actually reverted $3.9 million of unspent appropriations. And those reversions, of course, add to your bottom line, are now available for appropriation for other purposes. And net, you end up with $2.7 million higher. If you look at the prior pages, essentially the governor's budget was balanced when it was presented and is even more balanced. In fact, you have a little bit of additional money available beyond the governor's recommendations for expenditure. The legislative stabilization reserve account.
Don, you switched to the goldenrod and I got lost on, you said on page 4, we can see where the spending policy makes up the difference. And what lines was that? I believe it was page 4.
Page 5 or the bottom of page 7, but let's jump to page 5. And you can see that line 22, you have a auto appropriation to the SIPA account that is approximately $45 million higher, $44 million higher than it was under October, Craig. And that's the difference between 163 million and 119 million.
Okay.
And you'll also see an auto appropriation to the general fund. Again, that's the guarantee under the spending policy of $10.2 million. So those are the two mechanisms you see. And you will also note a sizably lower balance in the PMTF reserve account estimated on row 26. We have declined from 357 to $301 million. On the school side, it actually ends up a little bit better. And why is that? Certainly you have the same issue with investment income on line 45 and line 51. You can see a loss of investment income on
page 7 or still on?
back to page 7, correct.
Again, please.
Yeah, let me repeat that. On page 7, line 45, you will see the decline in investment income that's impacting the school foundation program in the amount of $67.8 million, but an increase in the guarantee. And I know that several of you will say, Don, you've rounded wrong. It's a guarantee of $67.9 million. Well, there was also a $100,000 change based upon the final state treasurer's annual report, which was made available in November. So the market value of the ending balance was slightly different, which means the spending policy is $100,000 different.
The guarantee is line 51.
Guarantee is line 51. The loss of investment income is line 45. They almost match up except for that oddity on the ending balance reported in November. On lines 46 and 47, and part of 48, you will see the increase from the increased natural gas price in calendar year 2022, offset by a decline in the natural gas price in this calendar year 23. The schools benefit from that in by way of FMRs, by way of property taxes, the statewide 12 mil, and a portion of that line 48 other recapture is also attributable to the 31 local mills also generating higher natural gas revenue as well. There's one more thing going on line 48. Well, actually, let's continue on. Line 50 is the subtotal of all of those. So the investment is a negative and everything else is a positive. So it's a net negative 68 million in revenue for the school foundation program. And you will see on line 52 estimated expenditures, and that is comprised really of two things, primarily changes in enrollment. So we have new enrollment numbers that are available to us at the end of December, first part of January. And Matt Wilmarth can correct me if I'm misstating anything. The state experienced lower enrollment, but the enrollment that was here was in higher paid districts. So higher number of students in the small districts, which are higher dollars per ADM. So it ended up costing more. I believe also in line 52, there is some increased entitlements incorporated in there from the lower natural gas prices going forward as well. Net on the school side, all of that change, we end up $5.5 million better off than we were in October. Rather small compared to the roughly roughly, $2.5 billion in revenue over the biennium. $5.5 million change is rather modest. On the school capital construction account, it's very straightforward. The only increase there is from state royalties, which I've mentioned several times, $5 million increase. Nothing else changed on school capital construction. You see that on line 62. And then on lines 69 and 77, you see the impact of those increased guarantees out of the two respective reserve accounts. The PMTF supporting the general fund and the Common School Permanent Land Fund supporting the school foundation program. That's where you experience the decline in investment income in addition to the LSRA on line 32.
So it's line 69 and 77.
Line 69, 77, and line 31. The LSRA's investment income is not guaranteed. So unlike the general fund and SIPA, it does bear a negative impact from the reduced forecast. Mr. Chairman, I know those were extensive remarks, and turn it over to Kevin for any comments he may have.
Mr. Chairman, I would echo Don's opening comments that there's a great team of individuals that help us with this report. Dr. Liu and Economic Analysis, Treasurer's Office, Oil and Gas Commission, University of Wyoming. We can't do this on our own, but the other person that is very helpful on this is Dean Tempty as well. So just a shout out for all those folks that help us roll this up.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, it all sounds like great fun.
Mr.
Go
Chairman.
ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Don, so just to recap the big picture, it sounds like the reserve accounts will be lower than we thought they were going to be by some amount. From a general fund cash flow point of view, is it still the case that as we in December said, well, we have about $912 million more in the general fund than we expected to have from the January 2022, Craig, is that still basically true, or has that amount changed materially?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is an accurate statement. You might bump it up to 915 rather than 912. And that's primarily because of the $3 million reversions more than anything else. So yes, that storyline is still exactly intact.
And that's what page is that on?
Mr. Chairman, I think you could probably get at that by looking at page 3, line 13. And before the governor's recommendations, Representative Stith indicated 912. To be specific, column J, row 13, page 3 is $912.8 million. Exactly what, very close to what Representative Stith said. You can see the governor's recommendation spent all of that money. And when I say spent, he allocated that money. Some of it went to permanent savings. A large portion of it went to permanent savings, but he allocated it. So it went to zero. And that was after his governor's rec using October Craig. And then moving across the line on column N, you can see that there is a transfer out to the LSRA of $3.9 million, which is approximately the amount of the reversions of state government. And I think that one line might best encapsulate Representative Stith's comments.
What line is that again?
Line number 13 on page 3.
But the latter statement about the LSRA. 34. And then the same for the common schools.
Mr. Chairman, moving to the school foundation program, it did better. So using again, Representative Stith's same rationale. Yes, page 4. In this case, I would draw your attention to line 39, row 39, which is the total balance available. And you will see in October, Craig, There was $950 million available in this school foundation program. Now, most of my materials do not refer to the 950 as being available. I refer to it in my comments as 850 because there's a traditional $100 million balance for cash flow purposes in the school foundation program. So when I have spoken in the past, I've referred to that number as 850, deducting that $10 million cash.
We've had discussions over time about whether or not we would still really need that 100 million as a balance.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And I think the same philosophy, the same philosophy applies on page 3, line 20, as to whether or not the 115 million should be some different number for the general funds cash balance. Moving across the page 4, line 39. So we start out with that 850 or 950 on there. The governor made a sizable deposit into the Common School Permanent Land Fund corpus through a diversion of, or a redirection of federal mineral royalties. That redirection can be seen on line 10 of page 4. And you can see he moved almost $250 million to the permanent fund, 248 million to the permanent fund. That is shown again on line 10. And then moving across the page to column N as in Nancy, row 39, you will see the net increase to the SFP balance based upon January, Craig, is about $5.5 million higher. So on the general fund side, we ended up, let's call it 3.8 higher. On the SFP, you ended up 5.5 higher. And one more just worth mentioning, and that's on row 68, also on page 4. You can see the increase on the school CapCon in the amount of $5 million. Again, all of the operating accounts have, single-digit million-dollar changes, rather modest compared to the declines in the reserve accounts that Representative Stiff noted.
And so, Don, at some point, will you walk us through what the increases specifically need to be for the individual funds on the, I think it's House Bill 181 now, or whatever it is.
Mr. Chairman, we can certainly provide that, but I did want to correct. Staff is not saying it's needed. I'm just saying if you want to use a forecast rather than an actual, this is the amount.
Well, why wouldn't you use the more current numbers?
Mr. Chairman, the caution I would say on the investment side is historically capital gains and losses have been a outsized impact on those funds. So we know we're not forecasting them. It reduces my confidence in that ending balance is probably going to be higher or lower anyway. So just keep that in mind when making any adjustment.
So committee, further questions for Don? So Don, I think at some point in time, it would behoove this committee to have you walk through Craig again in a more detailed fashion like you did in October for the new committee. I don't know if we want to do that right now, but I just think for educational purposes, we ought to schedule a time next week and voluntarily who wants to be here. But I need you to do it for me, so I can't imagine the other folks might not need it as well. So just put that on your to-do list. I just think it'll be a useful exercise. Okay, with that, anything else, Kevin? See if you can drum up some more money by the next couple of weeks, right? So do we have a preference on what bill we want to review next?
What were two options, Mr. Chairman?
We have ARPA and Capcom.
And let's take Capcom first.
Let's take a 10-minute break before we. ARPA,
Oh, you want to take ARPA first? Or
Yeah.
Capcom first?
ARPA. It's less contentious.
Knock that out.
But we're going to take a little break first. We can, got some folks Drag those folks in. All right. Welcome. So you ready for a spitball or two? Okay. Please proceed.
Good morning, members of the committee. I'm joined this morning by new LSO staffer, Associate Fiscal Analyst Hank Hoversland. You'll
Say his
recall
name again. I'm sorry.
Hank
Hank
Hoversland. Yes,
Hoversland?
correct.
Where are you from, Hank?
Mr. Chair, I'm from Casper.
All right, cool.
Mr. Chairman, we'll be walking through 23 LSO 0410, formal draft 1.0. This is an educational presentation only. The committee has not voted on this and is subject to change going forward. Yes, American Rescue Plan Act Appropriations Amendments. My next,
By the way, Hank, this was the mayor of Sheridan. My grandfather was the mayor of Casper for 2 terms back in 1950s. So, there. Right.
I did not know that.
Go ahead.
unlike the budget bill, which took us a considerable amount of time to walk through, this has only 10 changes. The budget bill itself had over 100 changes to the governor's, with the governor's recommendation and JAC action. So this should move more expeditiously.
Don, would you just give an outline of the bill and
Absolutely. And this one is a little tricky, frankly, particularly for members on the floor. So for your explanation and education of your colleagues, section 1 is pretty straightforward. It's definitions. And this is standard for all of the ARPA legislation that we've had. And in fact, the CARES legislation going back to May 2020 had similar definitions. Then the tricky part, the entirety of section 2, which begins on page 3 and runs through the bottom of page 18. That is all existing law. That is essentially the meat or the heart of 2022 Senate File 66. There was considerable thought by our legal staff in how to present this. And they actually thought, well, could we just go in and strike or repeal certain lines of that bill and avoid bringing in the entirety of that statute? And yes, you could with just the JAC action, but the concern is the floor amendments then will start coming, and every floor amendment would be 13 pages long at minimum, because we would have to bring in the entirety of section 2 Senate File 66. So now it's all listed out there for you, and Hank will go through the changes, but I want to highlight some of the concerns. So just like the supplemental budget, if your colleagues have a desire to repeal or reduce, that is not always possible, because in some cases, those funds have been encumbered and in fact, in some cases, entirely expended. A good example of that appears on page 4, line 2 and 3 for the provider relief. I believe all of that $5 million has been expended. So if one of your colleagues wants to strike that out, the challenge with that is the bell has already been rung and you can't unring that bell. However, you can see, well, you were able to change things. How come? Well, those changes that the Joint Appropriations Committee are either repealing funds that were unable to be expended, that the governor is returning, or you're adding to those appropriations. So that's kind of the distinguishing factor there. Then when you move to section 3 of the bill, which begins on the bottom of page 18, that's entirely new language. Where again? Section 3, beginning on the bottom of page 3, just one line on page 18. That's entirely new language. These are new programs. There's only 4 of them. And all of that is, if one of your colleagues wanted to eliminate anything after page 3, or excuse me, page 18, yes. Section 3, everything's up for grabs. No issues of prior appropriations. And then finally, Director Hibbard noted on the heels of our Craig presentation, kind of a positive announcement. You saw the declines in investment income that were provided in the Craig report for the permanent funds. Unfortunately, we probably would have had to do the same thing in terms of pooled income, that is non-permanent funds which support the general fund, except the fact that the state budget department and the state treasurer's department have, or state treasurer's office have worked diligently in developing a cash flow for ARPA and have tenor matched many of those expenditures with US Treasuries, and pleased to report that they will be depositing $6 million or thereabouts in investment income just for the first 6 months of the year off of these same federal funds that haven't yet been expended. That basically offset any declines that we would have had to take in our non-permanent funds. So a positive story there that's worth mentioning. With that, Mr. Chairman, I think we've talked about section 1. These are just boilerplate definitions.
Before you go through two questions, I'm trying to anticipate the. Did you have one too? Well, go ahead. Go ahead, Senator Greer. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, okay. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just a question, Don. In the second section, section 3, actually, section 3, if the floor wanted to take some of there's still some money unencumbered, is that where that money would go? If you had an idea, say I want to put $500,000 towards XYZ program using ARPA dollars, is that where it would go after section 3?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. So not only is section 3 entirely amendable, you can increase it, decrease it, eliminate it, do what you will with it. This committee, after your changes to the governor's recommendation, has left $33.8 million on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
38.3.
33.8.
And then Senator Gru's question was if they wanted to create a new program, they'd put it in section 3 or create a section 4.
And Mr. Chairman, if you wanted to create a new program, let's just say broadband, for example, that is currently not in the bill. It's a permissible use of ARPA funds that would appear in all likelihood in section 3.
Don, along those same lines, or maybe Rennie, I don't know. So if there was an existing program addressing a need in the state in the way we originally outlined it, maybe we feel doesn't give the attention we'd like to see to certain aspects, can we amend that program with funds and maybe redirect more specifically within the guidelines, but then provide guidance on how we'd like to see some of these projects addressed?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, absolutely. And there's some good examples of that. And I don't want to steal Hank's thunder. We'll get to the actual changes, but to respond to your question, you added more money for food insecurity. It was originally appropriated $250,000. It was really for planning, that $250,000. You added $3 million and changed the footnote for purposes of implementation. That's a good example of, hey, we want to change the language associated with that.
Thank you.
So Don, Mr. Chairman, just double check. The 33.8 is unencumbered and unspent. So I'm trying to think of the most efficient way for the floor to do their amendments. Need to have a little bit of understanding of what the ARPA buckets are, but you know, where we put more money into a program, somebody who doesn't like it could easily back that out. And that should be evident to them in the bill.
You could tell the floor that you can only do technical changes.
Yeah. Well, it's been done before.
So then, and Hank, this might even be a question to you. I don't know. So when we took the governor's recommendations, there's in December, there were a number of those that we denied, and then we put the money back up into some other, like the infrastructure and things of that nature. So is that laid out then in section 3 and 4, and that's where the House members, that's kind of a territory that's open for amendments or change?
Mr. Chair, yeah, that's correct. Section 2, where you increased the governor's recommendations, I think you're referring to the Health and Human Services capital construction and the eligible water and sewer projects. That's going to appear in section 2. And that can be amended because those are additional funds that you put in, that extra 30 million to each of those programs. And then you're also correct, section 3 that begins on page 18, that table is also open for amendments that you can add new projects there. Or I think going back to a previous question, if you want to add more money to some of the section 2 projects, that's open for amendment as well.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up, so then Hank, so, and I'm just trying to get my head around the structure of the bill. So section 2 really is existing programs that we've already been working, but we've added to those and in those additions that we put in last month and how we kind of done that as a committee. Those components or those funds could yet be altered by our colleagues or within this committee.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, correct.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think we will proceed through the 10 changes, and I'll turn it over to Hank for a discussion of that beginning on page 3, section 2.
Go ahead, Hank.
Mr. Chairman, Hank Oversland, LSO. I'll start, and this should be in your packets that you received, with the fiscal note and kind of do a quick overview of the differences between the actions you all took in December and what the governor's recommendations were. So this bill 23 LSO 0410 formal draft 1.0 appropriates a total of $38,264,206 from ARP-D. $26,664,206 of this is the net in section 2. That comes from $48.3 million in reversions. The bulk of that was from the governor's office. And then the other came in the Department of Health, and I'll touch on that when we get.
Are you on the fiscal note or are you?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
All right. So top line is 45 million reversion from the emergency fund, right?
Yeah, and then there was also reversions, and you can see those on page 4, line 1. There was a reversion of almost 2.75 million from the Department of Health for the Wyoming Home Services Program that was not eligible for ARPA. And recall from yesterday, you will find that in the budget bill that was general fund. The general fund will now bear those costs, and that will appear in the supplemental budget bill. And then if there's no further questions, there's $75 million in additional appropriations to existing programs from 2022 Senate File 66. And those occur on page 3, going back to the bill, sorry. Those occur on page 3, lines 17 and 18. You can see Agency 24, State Parks and Cultural Resources. There was an additional $12 million in line with the governor's recommendation to the Outdoor Recreation Grant Program. There was no associated changes with that footnote. And there may be a question moving back up to line 16, my apologies, about the workforce programs in the governor's office. That will appear in section 3. We treated this as a new program because per the governor's letter and your action in December, this is shown, the additional money for workforce programs was given to the Department of Workforce Services rather than the governor's office this year.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
So I'm looking at line 16. I don't see a change to the $10 million on line 16.
Mr. Chairman, there's not going to be a change in line 16. And that's because last year in Senate File 66, the legislature appropriated that $10 million to the governor's office. Per governor's letter 18 this year, and your JAC's action in December, this will be put in Agency 53, the Department of Workforce Services. So you will find a workforce programs, but that'll appear in Section 3 as a new program.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Hey, just make sure, because it's easy to get agencies mixed up. This workforce program that you're talking about that was pre-existing is in the governor's office and not in workforce services.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's correct.
And follow up, and we had a request, I think at least one, looks like just one, on the workforce services that we declined to fund to move those funds around. And so we're not referencing that. We're referencing the one in the governor's office. Yep.
Mr. Chairman, the additional funds appears on page 20, line 9, where you added, consistent with the governor's letter, Workforce Programs 2. This Workforce Programs 2 is a different program because it's in a different agency, the Department of Workforce Services, Agency 53, as opposed to last year's workforce program, which is housed in the governor's office.
Okay, and I apologize. I'm easy to confuse, Hank, so bear with me. So the one last year, the one that we've seen was the 5 million in the governor's office. Or is that the one that we're putting this year?
Mr. Chairman, last year, the legislature appropriated 10 million to the governor's office for workforce programs. This year, governor's letter 18, they asked for 5 million, and you all reduced that in half and gave 2.5 million to the Department of Workforce Services, which can be found on page 20.
Thank you. I'm with you now.
Okay.
Please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Hank, on page 3 of the bill, line 15, the 4.4 million, that's what was actually spent of that 50 million, correct? And then the remainder is what we reverted of roughly 45 million.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that's correct. There's no further questions. I'll move on to page 4. Again, going into page 4, line 1, you can see that reversion from the Department of Health of 2.75 million for the YHS program. That again will appear in this supplemental budget bill and will be funded with general funds. And when we get to page 8, I can point it out, but on page 8 there, footnote number 12, I believe it is, will also be stricken because that money will not be spent. Moving down to lines 9, 10, and 11, you can see an appropriation, and Don had mentioned this.
I'm sorry, go back. This is the YHIS program. We funded it for 1 year. And we put in the budget to continue to fund it. So I'm lost about the reversion. Why would this money have reverted?
Mr. Chair, Senator Kinski, Senator Nethercott's correct. This was not eligible for ARPA. So it is reverted from the ARPA bill, this bill.
Okay, and that's what we put in the note, actually, right? We said if it's not available for ARPA to spend general fund.
Mr. Chairman, this one did not have a backstop. So there's a variety of different options. The WWAMI program did have a backstop, meaning if ARPA funds were deemed impermissible, then general funds backed that up. In this case, they only received ARPA funds last year. It was determined that those expenditures are not permissible under ARPA. So we're striking out the ARPA funds and replacing them with general funds, which you approved in the supplemental budget by motion.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, again, back to lines 9 through 11, you will see that $250,000 that was appropriated to the Department of Family Services for the Food Insecurity Network evaluation was increased per Governor's Letter 18 and your action, JAC's action in December, by $3 million. Line 10 shows that we did change the name of the program from Food Insecurity Network Evaluation, which is what that $250,000 was used for last year, to now Food Insecurity System Improvement. We also made amendments per your motion to footnote 13. So that footnote 30, my apologies. That appears on page 17. And what we did with that, and Don alluded to it earlier, was we said of this total appropriation, the 250,000, we kept the same language from last year, was for the planning and an evaluation of the statewide network on food insecurity. And then said of this appropriation, the remaining $3 million is going to be for grants to act upon the evaluation that was completed last year by the Department of Family Services. So these will be grants to Wyoming programs that can act upon the evaluation that occurred last year. If there are no questions about that, I'll move down to lines 13 and 14. The Office of State Lands and Investments for the Health and Human Services Capital Construction. Recall last year in Senate File 66, the legislature appropriated $85 million for this program. The SLIB has expended all of these funds, and it's my understanding that the Office of State Lands will not be taking new applications under this program if this is approved. Rather, I believe that they will use existing applications and eligible projects, and they will allocate this through the SLIB. They will allocate this additional $30 million if it's approved. You may recall Governor's Letter 18. The governor asked for an additional $15 million. JAC in December adopted that and added an additional $15 million to make it a total of $30 million extra dollars, or a total program cost of $115 million. Subject to any questions, I'll move down then to lines 16 through 18.
And so that 30 million isn't reflected on this page. Is that on section 3? Or is it?
Only in the right-hand column where you show the difference between.
Goes from 85 to 115.
Mr. Chairman, moving down to lines 16 through 18. Again, this is in the Office of State Lands and Investments for eligible water and sewer projects. Again, the governor asked for an additional $15 million for this program. You all increased that by $15 million for a total of $30 million. The legislature appropriated $50 million last year, so that will increase it. And you can see on the right-hand column to $80 million total for the project. Again, it's my understanding that the SLIB will not be taking any new applications for this program. Rather, they will use existing applications that are eligible for ARPA and appropriate if it's appropriated, and allocate this additional $30 million to existing.
So on both of those programs, if we want new programs, or if we change some of the criteria, then that would be an amendment to section 3, or we amended on this page. Don?
Mr. Chairman, if you want to change who could be eligible for that, for example, let's say you wanted only pediatric clinics or something like that eligible for that, we would likely carve that out in the footnote. Within the 115 million, we could say of this appropriation, 5 million is available only for pediatric clinics impacted by COVID. I'm making this up, obviously, as a hypothetical.
Go ahead.
So Don, in considering those kind of changes, it seems to me that the governor's office or state lands has put together rules, and the rules exist, or they've been promulgated and they're out, and so they're basing allocations of these funds on those rules. And it seems like if we were going to mess with who then is going to get them, that you ought to, I mean, they're kind of basing that on the amount of funds that are available, and looking at that, it seems like we would, if we're considering that we probably ought to add funds with maybe the nuance associated with how we want to change it. Does that make sense? Or
Mr. Chairman,
but not required, I guess.
Mr. Chairman, two comments maybe as a comparison. Number one, On page 25, I just want to be very clear, and I'm jumping ahead here, but section 5 protects everything that's in place. So that's our language to ensure that nothing in this bill can be construed to modify or impair anything, any action that has been affirmatively taken by SLIB going forward. Now, as to the additional monies, the $30 million, I believe the legislature can put the terms and conditions on those new funds as it deems appropriate.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. So Don, for example, like the local government supports, they're just taking those applications now, so nothing's been committed, but the rules have been crafted. And so does page 25 protect those funds based on the rules that have been crafted? And to where there would be any, we couldn't mess with that because, am I making sense of my question?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's a great example. As I understand that program, the applications are due at the end of January, around January 25th or 23rd. So if they act before you act, they are protected by section 5, not their application, but the approval by SLIB. If they act after you act, then they are not protected by section 5.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Representative Sherwood Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess just looking at the crystal ball, may I? We saw that the application or the demand for the eligible water sewer projects was higher than what was allocated. That's why we're seeing an increase this year. I'm going to predict we're going to see the same for that local government program. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So Don, following up on Representative Larson's question, the new $30 million in water and sewer, I'd like to see some different sideboards put on it, which means they're going to have to rewrite the regulations, which seems to take forever, or at least an inordinately long time. And I don't know what that period is relative, and then they have to accept new applications and so forth. I don't know whether it's an 18-month process or it can be contracted to 6. But I'm worried about the deadline on the ARPA funds. Do they have to be expended by December 31 of 2025? Or
Yeah.
22, or just committed by December 31 of 2026?
Mr. Chairman, they do need to be expended under current law by December 31st, 2026. They need to be allocated, meaning the legislature must make their final decisions as to appropriations no later than December 31st, 2024. So you have this session and next session to provide a little bit of additional insight into Senator Kinski's remarks. Under your first go, and that's why we walk through this if you want to make changes or whatnot, but under your first motions, you had not changed the uses of the additional $30 million. If you wanted to put additional sideboards on, we probably would move that money from section 2 to section 3 to make a clear delineation and say, these funds shall only be eligible for communities, who meet certain criteria.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, and I know the demand far outstripped the amount of funds, but there's an unlimited demand by engineers for money for pipes. But my understanding is their regulation gave the highest priority to somebody who is ready to go, which meant, in at least the case of my hometown, their highest priority was a project they already had funded. So all they did was save money. And the priority I had was to extend water and sewer so that we could build some housing. And I don't want to see that happen again on the apps that are, I suspect my town's not unique in submitting applications for projects that are already funded because they higher priority if you're ready to go. And so I really want to, I personally want to see some sideboards on that money to see that it goes to something other than, I mean, it's okay for the legislature to swap out funds to save money, but we don't want everybody else doing it, do we?
Rennie, I think you had a comment on if we do this, what do you envision and the rule changing and the timing of that sort?
Mr. Chairman, thanks. Randy McKay, Governor Gordon's policy director. So with the programs that are run through SLIB, just point out what the office has done is done emergency rulemaking on these fronts, so that's much more expedited. And then after the emergency rules are in place and the application period can start, so that takes about a month to, if they need to go quickly to start the application process. Then following behind that, with, as is the case with all emergency rules, is the normal rulemaking process. So in almost all instances, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the standard rules are now in place for all of these programs. The emergency rules allowed the program to proceed. I will note that the program and the rules all give discretion to the board. As you point out, Mr. Chairman, elected officials like their discretion. So if you want sideboards, you probably need to think about this program very differently, because you're running through this through the board. And they absolutely have discretion and use the rulemaking and use the priority rankings that were established both in statute and in rulemaking, but you did not, I think that appropriately you gave discretion to other elected officials on that. So it's you have a little balancing act ahead of you on that front. And I would just flag that on the Health and Human Services Capital Construction Program, there's actually essentially 3 programs that were created under Senate File 66. So I think you would probably want to have a discussion about which of those programs you want that 30 million allocated to, and then amend the footnote to do that. Or to your point, add language to the footnote. If you do changes, there will be new rulemaking. So your choice would be between, do you want to start a rulemaking process after this bill passes, or do you want to try to have this go as quickly as possible? And that would mean leave everything in place and the existing rules stand, and the program and the existing applications can all move very quickly if you leave the footnotes on those SLIB programs in place.
And then when does SLIB meet next in order on the funds that if we wanted to modify what hasn't been allocated yet? You say slow down the bus.
Mr. Chairman, so the unallocated funds are the 50 million in the local government program. The application period ends on the 23rd of January. Then because both the statute and the rules do contemplate prioritization and rankings to present options to the board, there is time, and we have not officially set a date for the first meeting to review those applications by the board. These have often been done either in a special meeting or in conjunction with another meeting if there can be time added to it. So it is not set right now about the time period between when the applications will be ready to present to the board for action. So that's how the process has gone. So if you're trying to stop that program, then you probably need to pass this bill sooner. But if you're also trying to stop the local government program and you don't like either the sideboards that are on it that you did put in place and want to amend it, we can have a conversation to go to the board and the Office of State Lands to let them know that you're planning to do that. And I'll get you some feedback about whether or not they are amenable to just slowing down as an agreement between branches.
Okay, any further questions?
Mr. Chairman, it seems that if we were considering changing the rules in the middle of the game or putting additional sideboards on the water allocation projects, I think we need to be careful not to punish communities for being self-reliant. That is, if a community has decided to tax itself so that it has funds, I don't think it should be punished for doing that. So, and I think all the communities are affected by inflationary costs. So for example, in Sweetwater County, the voters have approved a 6-penny tax to tax ourselves to build certain projects, including a wastewater project. However, inflation means that it's very likely that the amount allocated on the 6-penny, which has a cap, will not be sufficient to complete all the projects. So if we do change the rules, I think we have to be nuanced about it so that we don't reward counties that have decided not to be self-reliant. So I don't think there should be a disincentive to do that.
Please.
Well taken. I don't want to punish anybody for being self-reliant. I get that part. And maybe my concern is more at City Hall than it is in the legislature. I'm frustrated that the engineers would take a broken pipe and put it ahead of extending infrastructure for new housing when people are screaming for housing. So it might just be unique to my engineers in my community. I can see your point though. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Okay, Hank?
Mr. Chair, I would just note one more thing on the eligible water and sewer projects. So just something to be aware of. I know that the Select Water Committee did approve a bill that just amended that program, and they added actually 39.3 million to that program under the idea of funding certain projects under that. And that's Senate File 82. So that's just something to be aware of that you may see.
Let's-
82, correct.
So 39 million.
39.3.
Coming from where?
Of ARPA funds. So they
The
took
33?
a similar,
Mr. Chairman, of the total ARPA fund, so, any committee or any individual member could, sponsor legislation that uses ARPA money. Under both the Senate rules and the House rules, that's the important, component that you see all appropriations. So you can prioritize and say,
That's what happened last time. They all came back here and then we prioritized.
Mr. Co-Chair,
Go ahead.
Hank, the 39.3, is it just water or water and sewer, water or sewer?
it takes a similar approach to what we did in section 2 here, and they just amended, they struck 50 million and increased it to 89.3 million. So it would be for the eligible water and sewer projects.
Oh, they didn't change the criteria though.
No.
Okay.
And so I'm curious, 39.3 is more than it's available, right?
Mr. Chairman, it is, and obviously they met, I believe, 2 or 3 days before you met in December, so there's a timing issue. I certainly don't, there may be a member here who sits on the water committee. I don't know whether that 39 is really only $9 million different than what you did, because you added 30, they added 39, or whether the goal was to add 69, 39 in the water bill and 30 in the JAC bill. That I can't divine that.
Why not?
Mr. Chair, just a note to follow up on that. There was nothing and there was no changes to the footnote to say that this is only if that this doesn't take effect if such a bill takes effect. So it could be seen as duplicative, but again, it will come to appropriations. So
I see that. Okay, please proceed.
yeah, Mr. Chair, just moving down bottom of page 4, lines 30 and 31, you'll see that additional about 26.7 million is changed on lines 29 and 30. Moving on to page 8, I'll just reference that quickly. Lines 11 through 14 is where we see footnote 12 struck for the YHS program.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll interject here on page 9, footnote number 16, we do have a technical correction. So when this comes up for markup on line 8, we need to change that to $93 million rather than $63 million. That's the $30 million increase for Health and Human Services. My thanks to Mr. McKay.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on to page 17, footnote 30. This is lines 9 through 18. This is where you see that change for that allocation, the appropriation to the Department of Family Services for food insecurity. I mentioned it earlier that this additional $3 million is now for the system improvement for one-time grant funds to Wyoming organizations to implement the recommendations from the assessment that was completed last year. And closing out section 2, I would just note and remind you all, JAC, of the actions you took. I talked about all of the programs that you adopted, but would remind you just quickly that you did deny money to the governor requested 4.5 million for WildLink. That was denied. 7.5 million extra for staffing stabilization, that was denied, and then 5 million for provider relief, that was denied. So that there was some savings there. The total bill appropriated 12.4 million less than the governor's recommendation. Moving on to section.
One second. then.
So thank you, Hank. Could we go back to page 17 and let me ask a question? So we had 250,000 in that food security program for planning. I don't know, was that all used? Okay, so I was going to say if there's any left in there, can that then be used for planning, or was it all consumed in, or for the, along with the 3 million, or do we?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, 225 is under contract.
So
It's
then,
encumbered.
thank you. So then, Mr. Chairman, with the remaining 25, can it be accessed along with the 3 million for that purpose, or does it just tied up there someplace in planning?
Yeah.
Do we need to add a footnote? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, moving on to section 3. Really beginning on page 18, line 19, and then moving on to page 19, the entirety of page 19. This is very similar language that we used in Senate, that was used in Senate File 66 and will appear at the beginning of the bill. Kind of outlining what the funds are for. And moving on to page 20, this is where we see the table that allocates those funds. This begins on page 20, lines 4 through 11. This is a total of 11.6 million for 2 really new programs and 2 what I'd call semi-new programs. So one of the programs that is on line 7 is the behavioral health redesign in the Department of Health. This was appropriated $5 million. This was an action of JAC. And I would note that in footnote 1 of section 3, it is backstopped by the general fund. So recall yesterday in the supplemental budget bill, Mr. Richards talked about the 5 million. ARPA funds are going to be used first under the language that we have presented here. ARPA funds are to be used first for any eligible expenditures. And if ARPA funds can't be used, then the general fund will backstop what can't be used. So that's what footnote 1 says. Then line 8, you have high needs and high risk youth to the Department of Family Services. Recall the governor's recommendation was 8 million. You all reduced this in half to 4 million total that you can see on line 8. And that is footnote 2 that begins on line 21. We used the proposals from the governor's office to craft these footnotes that you all saw with the governor's letter. And so you can see that in footnote 2. Then the 2 semi-new programs, again, we talked about this in section 2 on line 9, workforce programs 2, the 2.5 million. Again, recall the governor asked for $5 million. This was cut in half by JAC in December at 2.5 million. And the footnote for that, footnote 3, is almost identical to the appropriation, the $10 million in section 2. Really the only difference is the agency. It goes to the Department of Workforce Services. And then finally, Judicial Letter 1 asked for $100,000 of ARPA funds for the treatment courts transfer. This is line 10. And footnote 4 begins on page 22, lines 9 through 12. Recall you made this appropriation effective only if Senate File 23 this year is enacted into law. So this $100,000 for the Supreme Court is only effective if Senate File 23 is enacted into law.
And Mr. Chairman, just to finish out the bill, section 4 is identical language to last year regarding the intent of the legislature as to reporting and transfers of funds. You will recall that the governor's office had requested additional flexibility. The JAC did not act favorably upon that request. And on page 23, lines 6 through 8, this prohibits any movement of appropriations. They cannot be changed, revised, or redistributed pursuant to the B11 process. So basically, it is what it is. You can't move money from workforce to local governments or vice versa. And the balance of that is the traditional reporting on a monthly basis. In fact, I think it's near real time with their website that they have produced. Section 5, we already touched on, which is a protection of existing contracts, and section 6 provides for the bill to become effective immediately.
Okay, further questions? All right, Don, I think we'll hold off on Capcom because that'll take more than 5 minutes. With that, I think we'll stand in recess until, and we'll bring back Capcom on adjournment of the respective houses. No, on noon recess, we're gonna have, well, we could do it after, but we're gonna have the governor's office informally present to us first. But we'll probably have time for Capcom after.
When were you suggesting Capcom on adjournment?
Or we could do it after the governor's
Yeah,
office
I'd
presents.
like to get to the governor's thing and get step through the Capcom as much as we can.
Yeah, so that way we wouldn't have to, we could get more work done after work done. Okay. Anything else, Rennie? Anybody else?